Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carrie Burke, your moderator for today's webinar, Elevate Your Application Security Program with Burp Suite Pro and ThreadFix. You may send in questions at any time during the webinar via the Q&A chat feature. We will collect these and address them at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Dan Cornell. As Chief Technology Officer and Principal at Denham Group, Dan leads the technology team to help Fortune 500 companies and government organizations integrate security throughout the development process. Presenting alongside Dan, we have Daffit Studdard. Daffit is the creator of Burp Suite and the founder of Portswigger Web Security, where he leads the ongoing development of Burp. He is also the author of the Web Application Hacker's Handbook.
Thanks, Carrie. All right. Well, I wanted to extend a thanks to everybody for taking the time signing on with us here today. This is Dan Cornell, and I'm really excited to have Daff on board. One of the things that we've noticed in working in a number of ThreadFix environments is that Burp Suite is ubiquitous in those environments, and so we're really excited to have the opportunity today to show off some of the integration capabilities, to talk about some of the use cases that we've found interesting for people that are using both ThreadFix and Burp Suite. And so let's talk a little bit about our agenda today. Daff's going to go through and do a demonstration of Burp Suite for anyone who might not be familiar with that proxy and scanning tool, and to show some of the capabilities of the integration that we've put together, how to install the ThreadFix plugin and so on. Then I'll provide some background on ThreadFix and the ThreadFix platform, and then we'll look at some of the use cases that are particularly interesting for organizations that are using ThreadFix along with Burp Suite. And at the end, we'll have time for questions, which, again, you can submit via the Q&A feature. And so without further ado, let's turn it over here, and I will hand control off to Daff.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. You should be able to see Burp Suite on my screen now. So for people who haven't come across it, Burp Suite's a collection of tools aimed at security testers and really anybody who wants to test their web application for security flaws. It's got a variety of manual tools aimed at hands-on testers, so tools like Burp Repeater and Intruder. And there's also a variety of tools for automating the process of crawling a target and scanning for vulnerabilities. All these tools work together, and you can pass individual requests or bunches of requests and responses between tools, so you can mix your automated work with your manual testing to pretty much do everything you should need to find vulnerabilities. The bugs that you find, the security issues you find, are all aggregated in this one place that you're looking at called the sitemap, where just to speed things up a little earlier, I just did some quick scans of some lab systems that we have internally here at Portswigger, just so that you can see some examples of some vulnerabilities quickly. The idea of Burp is that it'll just work out of the box for quick and easy scans, but it also, under the hood, it has a real wealth of options and more esoteric and advanced tools for the more advanced manual testers to work on. Today we're going to be focusing on automation and how you use the automated scanner to find vulnerabilities, and then Dan's going to talk about how you pull that information over into ThreadFix. So in terms of doing scans, there's a variety of ways you can do that. Within the sitemap, we can select a particular branch or a particular host, and we can kick off a spider of that content, or we can do different types of scanning. If you're working manually, for example, with the proxy tool intercepting your traffic, you can also select individual items pretty much anywhere like this in Burp and just do a targeted active or passive scan of that one item. You can schedule scans to run at a later time, and you can also use this feature that we call live scanning. And what this means is, if you turn this on, as you browse around the target application using your browser, you will be automatically kicking off scans just of the areas that you visit. So if you want to do a really focused test of a particular mechanism like the shopping cart and the checkout, you can just use your browser to walk through that functionality, and Burp will just scan the areas that you visit, so you don't need to figure out what the URLs are or the rest of it. So I'm just going to dive in and look at some of the kinds of vulnerabilities that Burp finds. So Burp Scanner actually has a variety of capabilities. So starting with fairly conventional dynamic scanning, if we just dive into some of these results here, say cross-site scripting, very familiar vulnerability here that's reporting that we sent this payload in the request, and we got some nice script markup back, and so that's going to report the issue. It highlights the relevant bits of the request and response, just to help you understand the vulnerability. So that's fairly typical conventional dynamic scanning, where we send payloads to the targets and look at the responses to see what vulnerabilities it's got. Burp also does IAST, which is interactive application security testing. So this combines dynamic testing with instrumentation inside the application. So we currently support .NET and Java platforms, and the way you use this is you export the Burp Infiltrator tool from Burp, run it on the target's web server that you're testing. So this would typically be in a staging or a development environment as opposed to production. And then when we do a scan, we can get a whole load of additional information and some really interesting issues. So if we look at, say, there's a file path traversal bug, this is combining the conventional dynamic scanning. So we can see Burp sent this very familiar payload, and we've been able to fetch the etc password file in the middle of the response. What Burp also sent was a fairly benign payload, which is just a domain name on the Burp Collaborator domain, and we got a boring response with nothing of interest, but what that has also given us is full details of the unsafe API call that's involved. So by sending that payload into the instrumented app, the infiltrator is telling us that input from Burp has hit this API call. Here is the value that was sent in, and here is the full stack trace which occurred when the vulnerability was hit. So this is really good in terms of being able to correlate where on the outside the route into the vulnerability is through these requests, through right down to a line of source code for the developer to go looking for a fix. Burp also does SAS, static code analysis. This is currently on the client side only. So when we run into JavaScript in the application we're scanning, we will do some static code analysis of that to find vulnerabilities. So if I just dive into this little section here we can see an issue where this is a case of a combination of reflection and a DOM-based bug. So Burp has sent this little canary payload in the request. We can see that's been echoed in the response and assigned to this variable, and then the variable is used in an unsafe API, so we can report the DOM-based issue. And there's a whole family of similar DOM-based issues that arise with different APIs. What Burp also has been able to do in the last 2 years is something that we call out-of-band application security testing. So this is something that it combines elements of Dust because we're sending payloads to the application, but where we find the evidence of the vulnerability, it's more like IAST because we cause the application to do something different than it normally does, and it actually makes a network connection to a server that we control. So if we look here at SMTP header injection, this is a typical vulnerability that you can find very neatly with these techniques. So we can see that we sent this payload, which has some new line characters followed by a BCC field and an email address, again on the Burp Collaborator domain. We sent that payload in the request. The response is boring, looks the same every time, but what we did get was an email to the collaborator server from the application we're testing. So here we can see the full details of the SNTP conversation that came through from the target. We can also find bugs like OS command injection in this way. So here's an example where we've gathered conventional DAS evidence for a vulnerability. So we sent this payload which does string concatenation and echoes the result back, and sure enough, we got the result back. We also sent, here is an injected OS command designed to do an NS lookup of that domain. The response from that was uninteresting. It didn't contain necessarily evidence of the vulnerability, but what we get here is a DNS lookup did happen on that domain. So here we can confirm the vulnerability exists regardless of whether any outputs or any other evidence comes back in the application's response. So really, by using the collaborator, it's able to find vulnerabilities that are totally invisible in the application's responses. So there's no difference at all in terms of an error message or some other differential response or a timing-based difference. The response might just be the same every time, and yet using the out-of-band techniques, we can still find the vulnerabilities. And we've got working payloads for virtually all of the server-side injection vulnerabilities that you could find using conventional dynamic testing. We've got payloads that trigger those and cause a ping back to the collaborator server to let us report the vulnerability. We're also able to report deferred interaction. So in some cases, the application takes your input and places it somewhere, and then in the background at a later time, it uses it in an unsafe way. So an example of this might be some overnight batch run, which takes your input and does some processing on it, like this is hours after you've sent the payload, and we might trigger an OS command injection vulnerability in the handling of that log. We can also, sometimes you get totally blind stored XSS vulnerabilities where your input that you've sent will only ever be seen by an application administrator. So if we look an example here of stored cross-site scripting, we can see some examples where we sent this request and we forgot about it, and this request has a general purpose breakout sequence followed by a dynamically loaded script with the domain name of the collaborator server, and we see that later on we got a DNS and an HTTP interaction from that. And well, this means that maybe an application administrator, in this case 20 minutes after we sent the payload, has viewed that input and we've compromised their browser. So again, the fact that we can report vulnerabilities even after the scan is finished is it's amazingly powerful. Okay, so that's just a highlight of a handful of different types of vulnerability that we've been able to find. In a minute, Dan will talk about how you can import those results into ThreadFix and work with them. I just want to show you how you go about loading the ThreadFix extension. So within the extended tool, this is a place where you can load your own extensions or third-party extensions. And we have the VAT store, which is a whole load of extensions that have been contributed by the community, by other burp users, and shared for you to use. And if we scroll down here, we can see ThreadFix. So to install this, we simply click on the install button on the ThreadFix screen, and soon enough we get ThreadFix tab popping up, and here you can see various options for importing things into Burp, for exporting scan results, and you can configure the location of your ThreadFix API endpoint. So at that point, I'll hand it back over to Dan to talk a bit more about ThreadFix.
Thank you very much, Dap. All right. So just to provide a little bit of background about what ThreadFix does, ThreadFix lets you, when you're running an application security program, it allows you to create a consolidated view of all of your applications and all the vulnerabilities that you have identified in those applications. Once you've got all that data in a structured central format, then you can start to prioritize application risk decisions based on this data. And then ultimately what ThreadFix lets you do is it lets you translate these vulnerabilities that the security teams care about into the tools that software development teams are already using so that those developers can get those vulnerabilities resolved faster. And the goal is to save time for the people in your security program and to get more vulnerabilities fixed faster, and also to let you take a much more quantitative view of your application security program. So looking at the workflow, what ThreadFix lets you do is it lets you lay out, here's all the teams that we have across the enterprise developing software, and here's all the applications that each team is responsible for. And once you've done that, you can load in the results of all the different testing activities you're undertaking. So if you're doing static testing with a Fortify or a checkmarks, if you're doing dynamic testing with Burp Pro, if you're doing IAST testing, all of those results of automated testing can be loaded into ThreadFix. But you can also load in the results of different manual testing activities. So if you are doing manual code reviews, if you are doing manual assessments and penetration testing, you can load those results in as well. And if you're getting third-party reports on external testing that's being done, those can be loaded in as well. And ThreadFix allows you to go through and call the false positives, but first it normalizes all this data that is being loaded in and dedupes it so that if multiple technologies or multiple methods are finding the same vulnerabilities, ThreadFix dedupes those for you, so you only have to look at a master list of all the vulnerabilities that have been identified. Once you have that data all in one central location, you can do reporting and analytics. You can understand more about how long vulnerabilities are surviving in your organization and use that to benchmark against publicly available data sets, for example, those from like Veracode and White Hat. Also, it lets you communicate these vulnerabilities over to the defect tracking tools that developers are already using, as well as IDEs. And by having all this data about your application security program in one central place, you can also translate that data up to GRC systems to give them a view into what your application security program is doing and to give application security a seat at the risk management table alongside other disciplines in security that may be more traditional and more mature. So looking at tracking the applications in your portfolio, again, you can lay out, here are all the different teams we have developing software. Here are all the different applications each team is responsible for. And you can mark those up with metadata. So what language or platform are they written in? Are they externally developed or developed by your in-house teams? Are they hosted facing the internet, facing partners, or only facing internally? And by capturing this metadata about your application portfolio, that gives you a tremendous level of flexibility in the reporting that you can do later on. So once you have your application portfolio laid out, as we talked about, you can load in the results of all these different testing activities. So static testing, dynamic testing, IAST, manual reviews, third-party bug reports, and so on and so forth. And ThreadFix is going to normalize that data and give you a single list. Given that single list, then you can start to prioritize these risk decisions based on data. So instead of messing with PDF documents, instead of messing with Excel spreadsheets, you can slice and dice this data to make a determination. Which are the vulnerabilities that I believe are the most serious? Which are the ones that I think have a compliance impact? Which are the ones that we need the development teams to fix first? Because let's be honest, you can never fix everything, and that's an unfortunate state of affairs, but it's one that's not going to change anytime soon. And so by having all this data in a structured central location, you can start to make data-backed decisions about what you want to do in your program. So this prioritization is going to determine which vulnerabilities do I send to the developers and when. We've also developed some additional technologies that can let you identify vulnerabilities that are potentially more serious. Specifically in the case of static analysis programs, our hotspot technology looks at the static analysis results that you have across your entire application portfolio and looks for situations where you may be sharing code inside of your enterprise, and that code is responsible for vulnerabilities. So think of it like a black duck or a dependency check where they're identifying known open source components that have vulnerabilities. This is performing a similar task, but it's looking at custom code developed within your enterprise being shared around to different teams and different applications. So what we want to do is empower your managers and your analysts to identify where are vulnerabilities where fixing one vulnerability and getting that code transferred to other teams may allow you to fix something once but actually have the risk reduced as other teams get access to the new and improved code. And so by doing this all in one central location, that lets you start to take a much more quantitative view of your application security program. It lets you look across the different teams or look between teams to identify which teams are being successful and which ones are really struggling. Which teams are introducing more vulnerabilities and maybe are slower at fixing, or which are the teams that are doing really well. And it lets you run experiments to say, let's train this team, bring in a trainer to work with a given team and see how their behavior changes over time. If you see good results from the training, maybe that means that you want to expand that training program out to other teams, or if you don't see the results that you wanted, maybe you need to take a different approach or prioritize other activities. The value here is by being able to look across all of the different testing activities that you're undertaking, that gives you a bird's eye view of your application security program so that you can run experiments and make better asset allocation decisions. You can make better decisions about what to do with the limited resources that you have to run your application security program. And finally, this lets you take these vulnerabilities, again, the things that security teams care about, and to transition them into the tools that developers are already using. That's one of the things at Denham Group that we've seen in our consulting practices as we work with organizations to help them stand up their application security programs. The biggest differentiator that we've seen between the organizations that really struggle and the ones that start to make progress is making that shift from looking at all the things that are identified in testing as vulnerabilities and instead transitioning them to be defects that the software developers care about. At the end of the day, to resolve the root cause of most of the vulnerabilities that are being identified, you have to get developers to go in and change code and get those application updates pushed live. And by getting vulnerabilities into the tools that developers are already using, that lets you, as a representative of security, take friction out of the process because you're saying, we understand the tools you're using, we understand how you do work, and we're going to take advantage of the investment that you and your development teams have made in setting up these tools and setting up these processes. So that lets us bundle vulnerabilities and ship them over to defect trackers and then to monitor the changes in the status of those defects that are created so that we can see when development teams believe they've resolved issues and we can schedule retests and potentially identify remediation failures so you can reach out to the teams that are struggling and not spend time focused on the ones that seem to understand what they're doing. So let's look at some of the interesting things that you can do with Burp Suite and ThreadFix together. And again, as I said earlier, really excited to have Dap on today to talk about Burp Suite. He had the chance to talk about some of the really cool stuff what they're doing with their Infiltrator IAST, with their JavaScript static analysis, and with their collaborator, showing that they're doing really advanced things in the dynamic analysis as well as other spaces to identify these serious vulnerabilities. One of the technologies that we have in ThreadFix is called hybrid analysis mapping. And what that lets us do is to correlate between the results of vulnerabilities identified with static analysis, for example, from a Fortify or a checkmarks, and to correlate those to vulnerabilities identified by dynamic analysis, for example, with the Burp Suite Pro. So for certain languages and platforms, we have the ability to load this data into ThreadFix, and for ThreadFix to say, these two findings aren't two separate vulnerabilities that need to be adjudicated separately. Instead, I believe this is representative of one vulnerability, and we believe that this one vulnerability, we have multiple pieces of information about that. And so if you're both using Burp to do dynamic testing of your applications and you have a static analysis program in place, by loading that data into ThreadFix, that can give you a more streamlined view. We're also looking to better import the results of Burp Infiltrator to, again, provide that additional data about the running state of the application when these vulnerabilities are identified or when they're exploited, because that provides the developers, well, on the security analyst side, it gives you better confidence that you're looking at true positives. And for developers, by being able to pinpoint specific lines of code or specific stack traces alongside of the dynamic evidence of the vulnerability, that gives them better confidence in the results and helps them reduce remediation times. ThreadFix also has what we call our scan agent technology. And what that does is it allows you to orchestrate different scanning and testing activities. And so that allows you, if you have Burp Suite, that allows you to drive the Burp Suite scanner and its automated testing from inside of ThreadFix. And as we'll see, that lets you, schedule one-time scans. So within ThreadFix, you could say, Burp Suite, I would like you to scan this application with this configuration one time. It also lets you potentially set up a tempo of scanning to say, hey, I want to run Burp Suite with this configuration every night at 9 p.m. against the latest build running on our test server. And as we'll talk about here in just a second, it also allows you to integrate and orchestrate both Burp Suite Pro as well as other technologies into developers' CI/CD pipelines. And that's one of the things that we've seen with deployments of ThreadFix is they go through maturity cycles over time, where organizations initially start out doing a lot of manual work, and again, manual testing is going to be part of any application security program, and using things like the ThreadFix plugin for Burp, that lets you, do your scanning from within Burp, potentially do manual testing as well, and load that directly into the ThreadFix server, saving you from having to save the result file. Out and upload it. And that's great. The next step of maturity that we see in a lot of environments is they start to set up a tempo of automated scanning that is being driven often centrally by the security team. And that's much what we talked about before. Let's make sure that we're running Burp scans of these applications every night, every couple nights, whatever the tempo might be, so that you have that base level of scanning that is occurring from an automation standpoint, and that allows your security analyst to focus their time exclusively on manual testing or dealing with changes, as opposed to them having to drive all of that scanning activity on their own. The next step that we see in organizations is they start to distribute a lot of the security testing activities, and that's typically done where we see these activities get pushed out to dev teams so that those dev teams can start to incorporate security testing into their CI/CD pipelines. And so with ThreadFix's scan agent technology used along with Burp Suite, that allows us to both allow analysts to do the manual testing that is so valuable and important for them to have time to focus on, as well as to have the central security team set up a tempo of scanning, and eventually to make access to the testing that Burp is doing available via the developers' tool sets, if you look at things like Jenkins driving their CI/CD pipelines. And so that's something that we're seeing in a lot of organizations that are looking at how do we start to incorporate security into the DevOps activities that we are undertaking. Just to quickly look at what this looks like in ThreadFix, you want to set up a testing policy so that you know what testing is going to be run when and how to make decisions based off that. And a lot of times that is going to involve a couple things. First, some testing. on a given build type, you're going to want to do, you'll run Burp Suite. You may want to run a partial checkmark scan, and you may want to wait for those in order to weigh in on whether or not that build is considered successful. There also may be testing activities where you don't want to wait for the results. You just want to kick them off or have them started by your CI/CD pipeline and have them resolved later. Next up, you have to make a decision with the results that you have. And what we give you the ability to do, you can obviously say, well, I don't want to ever pass a build if this application has critical or high vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, that's not politically tenable in a lot of organizations. And so we also let you set up policies that say things like, we may have to accept that there are currently existing critical or high vulnerabilities, but I want to break the build if anybody introduces any new critical or high vulnerabilities. That tends to be, in a lot of environments, that may be more acceptable because everybody, while we might not have the ability to remediate all the vulnerabilities in the application right now, everybody can usually agree that we don't want to be introducing new serious vulnerabilities. And finally, we need to do reporting on what we've found. And so ThreadFix lets you take the results of your burp testing, of other testing that you might be doing, and say, I want to report, I want to create bugs for anything that is the severity medium or above. And I want to bundle those by type, so that if I run a scan and find 7 new cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, as well as 2 new SQL injection vulnerabilities, let's create 2 different bugs for those, one that contains the SQL injection, one that contains the cross-site scripting. Or whatever, however you want to package those vulnerabilities so they're going to be the most consumable by the development team. And so what we want to allow testing teams to do is to work with their development teams, get a good configured automated scan with Burp and with potentially other technologies, and to let them drive that higher tempo of testing with an understanding of how the results are going to be used on the other side. And so just to quickly look through what this looks like, we set up the configuration for the testing that we want to do, setting up Burp Suite scans, potentially setting up check marks, fortify other scans, then making a determination of how do we want to make decisions about this build, right? What sort of bugs are we going to allow? What sort of introduction of new bugs or of new security vulnerabilities are we going to allow? And then finally, for the reporting, when we get new vulnerabilities based on these testing activities, what do we want to do with those? What's the threshold for creating a ticket in an automated way? And how do we want to bundle these vulnerabilities so they're going to be the most consumable by the development teams? So in doing that, we can then, driven by Jenkins or the CI/CD pipeline, for a given build type, we can kick off these testing activities to say, for this type of check-in or on this schedule, I want to run my burp scan, I want to run a differential checkmark scan, and based on the running of those scans, I want to get the results and make a determination of, do I want to pass the build or do I want to break the build? And based on new vulnerabilities that have been identified, how do I want to use those to create new software defects? And so in doing that, what that allows us to do is to start to improve the maturity of our program as a whole, going from a situation where analysts have to do a lot of this work on their own, or they have to drive all of these activities, then moving to a situation where the security team centrally controls a lot of the scanning, and ultimately ending up in a situation where the security team can enable the development teams to start to take over aspects of the application security testing program. And again, we're not saying that everything is going to be automatable, not saying that all the responsibilities are going to be pushed out to the development teams, but what this progression gives you is the ability to have options about where you want to allocate different activities, to take advantage of automation and systems that are already in place, as well as to hopefully identify new opportunities for automation. And in doing that, again, what we've seen in our ThreadFix client environments is Burp Suite is pretty much ubiquitous there. These are tools that most folks have in place and are using. And so for organizations that are using ThreadFix and Burp Suite, there are some exciting things, or at least I think they're exciting things that you can do using components such as the ThreadFix plugin for Burp Suite that you get from the BAP store, as well as ThreadFix's scan agent technologies and things like our Jenkins plugin to drive CI/CD integration. Now we'll open things up for questions. If everybody could go to the Q&A session. We've got a couple of questions here. The first one is, are you planning to add better automation features to Burp Suite? So we'll turn this over to Daph. Yeah, what do you have to say about additional automation features in Burp Suite?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, originally Burp was aimed at manual testers pretty much exclusively. The first tool I wrote was Burp Intruder, and then gradually broadened it to have the proxy tool and the repeater tool. But the emphasis was very much on giving you the manual tools you needed to do a hands-on test. After that, over time, we broadened our focus and added more automation, particularly around the spider and the scanner. And that's really where a lot of our recent innovation, I think, has been. What we really like doing is providing automation that is really helpful for manual testers as well. So if you're like me, when I was a pen tester, you're generally lazy and want the tool that does your job for you. What we really like doing is finding ways of solving the problems that are boring for a manual tester and automating them. One particular area that we're working hard on is the crawler. That is obviously it underpins the whole of the automated scan. At the moment, in many situations, there's still some manual setup to do to handle different session handling mechanisms and that kind of thing. We're working on ways that will totally automate that, so that the automated crawl is at least as good as a dedicated human can do. So even manual testers will be able to rely on the automation to do their job.
Excellent. Next question is, shifting from mentality of security issues to one of defects is critical. Many orgs push back, though, because they want security separated from the feature functions bug fix backlog. How do you change the minds of your customers on this point? Great question. And just a couple of points on this. Again, if you want developers to fix it, I've been saying for a long time that developers don't speak PDF, and they inconveniently also do not speak Excel. And so if you want to communicate with developers, hopefully everybody can agree that mailing PDFs, or even worse, having security analysts take PDFs and turn them into Excel spreadsheets and sending those along is suboptimal, not a great use of anyone's time. One of the things that we've found to be very important with ThreadFix, especially as you bring teams on board, as you bring development teams on board for a more regular testing program, is there has to be an understanding between the representative from security who's concerned about vulnerabilities and the representative from development. And one of the things that we see is typically after you've done some testing, especially as you're just getting an application onboarded, the ability to take advantage of the configuration of JIRA so that they can set up templates for things like security issues that maybe bring in different metadata, that is very helpful, again, because you can let the developers kind of shape what information that they want to see coming over. But also getting that process set up, or that agreement in place of here is what we are going to communicate to you, right? We're not going to just take a scan and blindly send it over there with all the info level stuff and false positives and things of that nature. It's also, how is this going to be communicated? And what we've found is that at the end of the day, if the developers are going to work on something, you have to have it in their backlog. But if you have an agreement so that you're not junking up their backlog with a bunch of stuff that you know that they're not going to work on, and if they have the ability in their reporting to look at their backlog as a whole as well as to separately look at security stuff, that helps to reduce some of the friction associated with this process. And again, by being able to move beyond a security purist mentality and instead understand the developers probably aren't going to do everything that I want them to do, so let me figure out the important stuff and let's craft policies on how we're potentially passing or failing builds, as well as how we are creating defects that are that recognize the challenging job that security teams have. That can help make it more acceptable for organizations to better treat security vulnerabilities as software defects. Let's see, the next question here for DAF is, when are you going to implement single-page application support and Site Explorer improvements in Burp Suite? So looking at Burp Suite being used to test single-page applications, I'll turn it over to DAF.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very much in our pipeline. As I mentioned a minute ago, we're very much focusing on looking at ways to improve the crawler to deal with the whole range of modern applications that we run into, and single-page apps, heavily stateful apps with a lot of asynchronous flows and transitions through functionality that don't correspond to conventional page loads or even request responses. This is very much a pressing concern that we're aiming to deal with. The obvious basis for the foundation on which to build a solution is to use a headless browser to drive the navigation. So you essentially have the machine browse the target very much like a human, by clicking on page elements and looking for changes and take it from there. It's a difficult problem to solve in general, and you can solve bits of it, and then you look at the real world and see all of the crazy scenarios you run into, and that's the phase we're at with that work. And we're aiming to have something hopefully releasable within the coming year, but we'll certainly keep you posted on that.
Excellent. Yeah, the people that are developing the web application frameworks rarely do the security testing folks a lot of favors by making applications easy to build securely and easy to verify at a certain level of security. So thanks, app framework developers. The next question, is it possible to natively embed Burp within a CI pipeline? So we looked at some of the stuff that you can do with ThreadFix's CI pipeline integration that lets you run, coordinate and orchestrate Burp scans along with a number of other technologies. Def, do you guys have a native Burp specific, either Jenkins or Bamboo plugin, or is that something that you've worked in a lot of environments seeing people do?
It isn't a native capability at the moment. Some people are doing it via our existing API, and that basically involves writing a Burp extension that provides the glue into whatever system they're using. What is very much in our medium-term pipeline is providing this capability natively. So we're working on a completely new edition of Burp that will install on a server or a bank of servers, will run fully headlessly, fully automated, and will be totally drivable through a REST API. And we'll also have native plugins for a range of popular CI/CD platforms. So you'll be able to do obvious things like kick off a dynamic scan against your staging server and break the build if you get any new issues. So again, this is something we're aiming to have publicly available around about the coming year.
Very good. Let's see, do we have any other questions? Feel free to send those in via the Q&A tool. I think we may have taken care of everyone's questions. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, again, I want to say thank you very much, DAF, for coming on and talking about this. Like I said, you guys are doing some really cool stuff in, not just the dynamic testing space, but also in the IAST, SAST with the collaborator and whatnot. Really excited to have these capabilities in ThreadFix that integrate with Burp Suite, and also want to thank folks who came out today. Appreciate you taking some time, and we will be getting the recording up within the next day or so and letting everyone know. So any final thoughts from you, Dave?
Okay, I just enjoyed it. Thanks for everyone who listened, and yeah, look forward to the next one.
Excellent. Well, very good. So keep an eye out in your email for a notification when we get the recording of this up. And again, appreciate you guys spending some time with us today. We'll talk soon.